just learned about so many of the benefits and the important synergies that happen within our bodies associated with the microbiome. For a long time, there's some key, well, not a long time, there's some key sharing kind of topics that when people talk about the microbiomes, they share. And we've heard a couple of these this morning, right? This idea that there are 100 trillion bacteria and archaea and fungi and viruses that live within us, right? Also that in these biomes, these cells, oftentimes these bacteria, the archaea, they're single-celled organisms. The majority of our microbiome are these bacteria, right? These single-celled small organisms that live within us and on us. The next one is this idea that there's our cells. These individual cells outnumber the cells that make us human 10 to 1. So if you take all your skin cells, your liver cells, the cells that make up the muscle that beats your heart, and then you look at the bacteria, all these little single-celled organisms that live in you and on you, they outnumber you 10 to 1. And this is one of that idea that we talk about, that you are your microbiome. We have 200 times the genes. Your cells contain genes that do almost everything that you need to do for your body as far as physiologically, but the microbiome, the bacteria, do so many more things that you don't even have in your own genome, right? There's genes that encapsulate for multiple other processes that you just can't even imagine as far as doing in your own body. Also, this idea that it weighs, it is a substantial amount of who you are. It weighs more than your own brain if you take up just this part of these gut microbiomes. And also in your gut, in your gut, you are sitting, all of us have a more dense ecosystem of bacteria and archaea than anywhere else on the entire planet. More so than the rainforest, more so than a deciduous coniferous forest. The density that you hold in your gut is more than any other biome on the planet. We have not always thought this way. We've actually waged a war on our microbiome. Some things that we've done, we've thought of them, as Kelly mentioned earlier, that they were noxious, that they were pathogenic, that they caused disease and harm. And a lot of microbiology from the first days, what was that? Was identifying this idea called germ cell theory, where we identified certain bacteria, we isolated them, we put them in healthy individuals, and sometimes we saw disease. And the big idea of microbiology early on was, how can we stop these diseases? Most of these diseases were associated with feces and things that we were producing out of our body. And so we kind of labeled them as noxious or pests or things that would kill us. In that kind of idea, we ushered in this idea of antibiotics. There was a researcher, his name was Selman Waxman at University of California, Berkeley. He was studying soil bacteria, and he noticed that certain bacteria, that there would be certain fungi that would grow on a plate, but there would be a ring or a halo around it where there was no bacteria that could get close to it. And he identified some of these substances as the first antibiotics. And then we realized that bacteria and fungi and multiple other things generate these antibiotics. And the reason they generated antibiotics was they said, I'm eating this food, I want the rest of you to stay away, right? I want this food, I found a nice little source for myself, everybody else, don't bother me. But what we ended up doing was we applied this antibiotic technology to ourselves. And we have heavily overused antibiotics in not only ourselves, but in industry associated with animal growth. And we have taken these things, and oftentimes antibiotics are not localized antibiotics. They work on most bacteria. And when we take these antibiotics, oftentimes we're hurting our own gut microbiome. There is times when they are necessary, but we have really overused antibiotics. The other one is birth via C-section. Your first baptism into your microbiome is, we all started this way, right? We started in a placenta in our mother's womb. There is very little bacteria. There are some, but there's very little bacteria in that environment. Your trip down the birth canal was your first baptism into your microbiome. Breastfeeding was your second, right? We picked up a lot of these bacteria that were essential for us that made our microbiome and started us each on this individual trip. And there's multiple research talking about how C-sections, they just don't have a lot of that beneficial bacteria. They're not, it's just not there. And the last one, we've had a big change in our westernizing of diet. We love our meats. We love our processed foods. We love a lot of those the carbohydrates that we're looking at. We sometimes eat high in fats. And all of these, and some information we'll share, is this idea that we've kind of waged a war on ourselves. And there's been this microbiome awakening where we understand that this microbiome really is the center of our health. And it's really time to stop this war of eradication. We have really dramatically, over the decades, even as scientists, dramatically underestimated the benefit of your microbiome. And to give you an idea of what the microbiome is, we're going to talk a little bit about the ecology, but a quick background on myself. We're going to go to this right here. I'm at what's called a microbial ecologist, and I've had the privilege of being a university professor and a scientist for the last 25 years. I've been a scientist for 25 years, a professor at Brigham Young University for the last 15, and I'm a full tenured professor. But what's wonderful is I've had the opportunity to go to multiple different places, locations around the globe. I started my career as a microbiologist in extreme environments. I went to Antarctica. I've been to the Arctic multiple times. I went to the deserts of the world in China and up in Mongolia to search for bacteria that did unique and beautiful functions that we just didn't see. And sometimes when you go to these simplified systems, when you distill down the species diversity that you have there, and you understand what these individuals in these microbiomes are doing. I also moved into a lot of water quality. One of the things that is essential to us in human health is the availability of drinkable water. And we've studied the pathogens that are associated with water. Later this year, I'm going to Peru. We partnered with multiple groups where we go and we look at microbiomes that are happening in these environments, if it's coming from alpaca feces associated with drinking water in these high Andes villages. And we've really looked at how do we understand the microbiomes of water and the good bacteria that are in there, and also sometimes the noxious ones or harmful ones. Some of you might have heard of a term called harmful algal blooms. These are those things where some bacteria actually make certain toxins that not by their evolutionary pathways, but they make them and we're actually sensitive to them. You are all fermenters. You might not really know it, but in your gut, you're walking around, and there's this idea that there's an aerobic environment and there's an anaerobic environment. Your aerobic environment, all of us are sitting here, we are aerobic organisms. We breathe oxygen, right? We breathe oxygen. Your gut microbiome does not breathe oxygen, right? They might breathe different parts or things that sometimes if there's a little bit of oxygen, but there are what's called anaerobic bacteria. They are using other things to power themselves. We, in this room, we eat food, right? We eat food, and it has all of these reduced carbon compounds. And we breathe in oxygen to capture all the electrons from that food. So that's really why we breathe oxygen, and then we breathe out CO2 as kind of a waste product. Other bacteria in your gut, they can use tons of different things besides oxygen as that acceptors for the energy from the food they eat. So I worked a lot. I did a lot in wastewater. I know wastewater. We don't really. I'm sensitive to what Kelly said. We don't really like talking about feces, but a lot of times I did the COVID response for the state of Utah and the National Institute of Health. I also did one for individual site buildings where they wanted to look at the environmental load of COVID that was in that location. So then we could say, hey, there's a lot of asymptomatic individuals here. We might, or you're having a population explosion in COVID cases. And then I do a lot of anaerobic digestion, where we take the waste of the world and we turn it into energy. So we take human feces waste, I know that sounds kind of gross again, or manure, and we turn it into methane through fermentive processes. And more recently, my lab has now taken this technology and we're using what we know in the study of the human gut microbiome. So communities, when we say microbiome, they're communities. And one of the best ways to think about this is this community, is this idea that if you think of things that you know, right? Adam put out this thing where you have all this, like the nature, you can see your nature. When I think of a microbiome or your gut microbiome, we'll talk about the skin microbiome here in a little bit. When I think of your gut microbiome, I think of a river, right? Your mouth is open here and it's open on this backside. And food is flowing through it, right? So rivers are beautiful and they're unique and they come in multiple different forms. You have been sharing your microbiome with each other since the moment you walked into this room, right? We're breathing, you're ingesting some microbiome, but a lot of your microbiomes are unique. They're unique to your age. They're unique to your exercise lifestyle. They're unique to the food that you ingest. All of these things come into building what your microbiome is. And you're also, we have to give you credit. You're all taking LoveBiome products, and so your microbiome is elevated more than a lot of other people. So that's a good positive as well. So you have these river systems. They're somewhat unique. And one way to think about it, if you've ever gone to a river or you've gone to a lake and you walk into the river or lake and you kind of feel this smooth material at the bottom and you're like, oh, that's algae. Like a lot of times we just call things algae. Algae is like a catch-all term. Same way with your gut. You have certain mucosal layers in your gut, in your small and your large intestine, mostly in your large, that house these bacteria for your gut microbiome. When you eat food, how we've developed evolutionary is, it goes into our stomach. It does not stay in our stomach for a long time. When you're young, you're like, oh, the stomach is the main part. That's where everything gets digested. Well, it's acidic, right? It has this low pH of about 2 to 5, but your food only resides there about 25 minutes. That's it. It moves from your stomach out into the small intestine, where it spends about 2.5 hours. It's really long. And you're like, oh my goodness, there's all this peristalsis pushing it through. And then it ends up in your large intestine. And there it stays for the longest period of time. And this is where your microbiome is the densest. This is where you have that more dense than the rainforest, multiple systems or multiple bacteria that are interacting together. So when we think of our digestive tract, think of your large intestine to your small intestine and the numbers of bacteria. Bacteria in your stomach, a few hundred per milliliter. In your small intestine, a couple thousand. But then you get to your large intestine and you have trillions of individuals. So when you look at something, so one thing we talk about is a microbiome as a community, right? This community. Sometimes it's hard for us to understand what a community is. And one thing these are called what's called a colony forming unit, right? CFU. And you would see this if you look on the back of your fire power, there's this unit that says, oh, there's so many CFUs. It's a colony forming unit. It means if I put it on a plate and I grew it up, that individual, each one of these spots is an individual bacteria that is populated or grown. In this case, we're looking at an individual CFU. They have to be in the millions. For you to see this bacteria, there is 1 million of individuals here, right? At least 1 million. For you to see that color and to see like, oh, this is something that manifests itself on the plate. A lot of stuff in your microbiome we can't grow on a plate. We'd never be able to see it. We can't culture it with normal techniques because, like I said, a lot of them are anaerobic and they take special chambers and special chemicals. We have them in my lab. I grow. There's not many of us scientists that work on anaerobic bacteria because they're tough to work on because it's basically you have to give them an environment that is similar it's so different than places that we see on the earth. Really, when we see our gut is a unique environment. We see the type of bacteria that we have in our gut in wetlands, in bogs, fermenting areas, and really that's about it. There's not that many locations like us here on this planet. One other way to look at this is communities you all live in neighborhoods, right? Y'all come from neighborhoods, and there's different people in your neighborhood, and sometimes they're different from you, right? So when we think of a community, and you think of community of bacteria in your gut, I love awkward family photos. This is a website where it shows kind of just the different types, right? It takes all kinds. Your neighbors, some of your neighbors, they might not look exactly like you. They might not eat the same food that you do, right? They might have multiple children that they like to dress in denim. They might have one that they just like to look like a mirror image of themselves, right? We're all different. We're all different. But we make up this community together. I'm not really going to comment on this one. But we all work together to form this community. That is the same way with your gut microbiome or your microbiomes on your body. There's multiple different bacteria. They all do. There is some redundancy associated with it, but they do different things. I'm going to show you, let's slip back into... So one of the basics is together, there is a synergistic type of activity that is beneficial for your health. And Kelly and Adam both this morning touched on this, right? One of the big things that we get, and this is kind of like one of the big ones that they start with. We're facilitating the recovery of energy and resources. All this means is you eat food, you yourself, you're not good enough alone to break down that food and harness all the nutrients, the energy, the minerals, the vitamins. You just can't do it yourself. So there's all this bacteria and all this community in your gut microbiome that is helping you do that. The other thing is it prevents growth of pathogens and the overgrowth or the ability for these pathogens to lock into your intestinal walls. Right? So you have this mucosal layer, right? That slimy, if you're thinking about your river and you're thinking about that slime that's on that river, that when the water or the food is passing through, that slime production, I know slime's not the best word, let's call it mucosal layer. That mucosal layer is basically inhabited by tons of beneficial bacteria. If you have a healthy microbiome, the people that are living there are the good bacteria that you want to see there that are helping you do so much more for your body. And in that they reside in those niches, they occupy that space and they don't allow pathogens to basically to intervene. And this is sometimes we talk this as dysbiosis or leaky gut syndrome, where we have that breakdown of that barrier and we're not able to really digest our food as well. It leads to cramps, intestinal problems, diarrhea, things like that. So pathogens, keeping out pathogens by occupying that space within our biome is great. The other one, they produce tons of antimicrobial proteins, right? They say, this is my area, and they say, stay away from my area. The other one, they break down tons of toxins. There is about, I think there's, in the literature I looked, there's multiple, like 60 different toxins that we know of, that when you ingest sometimes we do, right? Some preservatives, maybe some fertilizer, different things like that. Toxins that come into our body are broken down by our microbiomes. We also synthesize some vitamins. B and K are the biggest vitamins that you can't make yourself. They are only being made by the gut bacteria that are in your microbiome. We make amino acids, short-chain fatty acids. All of these things are precursors or building blocks for you to do what you need to do in your body. We also, this is probably to me, as Kelly touched on this, right, this idea of the gut-brain microbial axis. The gut microbiome is really your second brain. You only make 90% of some of your serotonin, right? Your drug, the neurotransmitter that makes you feel well and happy is generated by the bacteria in your gut. So when people say, oh, I have a gut feeling about that, or I have butterflies in my stomach, there is this connection between how you are feeling and the wellness associated with your gut microbiome. This is what I don't like. So as a scientist, one of the big things, I teach classes where it's big, the importance is to share information in a digestible fashion. And it's just nice that we're talking about digestion and somewhat in gut microbiome. We'll talk about the skin microbiome in a little bit. But this idea, this is what, when I as a scientist, people are like, oh, well, the gut microbiome is dominated by the bacteriophylum of Bacillota, right? And Bacteroidota and Actino, and you're just, and everyone's eyes kind of roll back in their head, right? And then they're like, oh, there's Clostridium and Rhinococcus, and sometimes I don't know how to pronounce some of these names, right? And I've been doing this for almost, over 2 decades. What is important, though, is to understand stories or messaging that you can share associated with this. So your gut microbiomes and looking at individuals of what there is that benefit. So to do this, one of the things is to understand how these species are interacting in a very general way. And I put this up here because it's called, I like to think of it as bacterial vomit, right? Bacterial vomit. So when you eat food, it goes into your system, and depending on what you eat is going to determine how many bacteria in your gut benefit from that material. If you eat simple sugar, right, it's over. It's done. One bacteria is benefiting from that food that you eat. Glucose is the major chemical that comes in to do a lot of our energy harnessing in what's called ATP synthase, right? Have you guys, or ATP synthesis, right? You guys have heard of ATP. It's that chemical that moves around and does a lot in your body. But sugar gets used up directly by an individual bacteria, and there's not much bacterial vomit that goes past that. When you have complex foods, right? Soluble and insoluble fiber, when you have polyphenols, things that are just not starch, because starch is good, right? But starch is just long chains of glucose. And they get broken down and they get used maybe by 2, right? 2 bacteria or so. But when you get polyphenols and you have soluble fiber and digestible fiber, those things pass and are complex enough to move from your stomach through your small intestine and into your large intestine. They are fuel for your gut microbiome. And that's one of the emphasis on prebiotics, right? Prebiotics, that idea of those flowers or the fuel that fuels everything else. So when you're taking some of the products with prebiotics with different color blends and high levels of polyphenols, those foods are actually making it to your large intestine and help nourish your gut microbiome. And vomit's kind of a gross way to think about it, but it's vomit that still has great value and do many things for us. So we're going to talk about a couple of the individual bacteria that 2 of these are in your are in the phytopower, right? These are those probiotics, right? So probiotic means the individual organism. Prebiotic is the food or the energy. Probiotic in Kelly's example would be the bee. So these ones to me, these are called bifidobacteria. That's not too hard to remember. Bifido, they are Y-shaped because they have equal lobes when they grow, sometimes under nutrient stress. Bacteria can be different shapes and sizes. But in this case, if you think of the bifido, it's this kind of Y bifurcation that is kind of taxonomically distinct for these individuals. Bifidobacteria to me are some of those super organisms, right? These organisms, there's 2 of them in phytopower, right? These species themselves convey much of the benefit that we see in the gut microbiome, right? 1 things they do is they stop tons of Heliopylori, which is that ulcer stomach type of bacteria that we have that's really detrimental in our stomachs. Clostridium difficile, or C. diff is sometimes what they call it, is this terrible disease of the lower intestine that causes horrible diarrhea. I mean, it's terrible. When people talk about irritable bowel syndrome, this bifidobacteria and the species associated with it are just some of the big players to protect ourselves from some of these pathogens. It stabilizes tons of our gut pH. It enhances the bioavailability of many minerals, calcium, zinc, and iron. It also does reduction of cholesterol levels. It leads to reduction of hypertension, and it produces thiamine, vitamin K, B6. It is like one of the super organisms that we have in our gut microbiome. Some of them are just hanging out and eating the vomit from another one, but some of them confer a huge benefit to us, and bifidos are some of those. And I love sharing little science. This is a recent paper. Bifido exhibits social behavior through carbohydrate source sharing in the gut. So these polyphenols, when they get down into your gut, these bifido species are actually cross-feeding and cross-talking to each other. One thing that we're realizing more about our gut, it's just not these passive bacteria, but as a community, everybody's talking to each other. So when you saw that awkward family photo, it would be like that awkward family photo was a community, and then they decided to do a sharing feeding co-op where everyone got together and they brought food every night and they all just kind of shared their food around, right? So there's this high level of intense cross-feeding that's going on between these species. Another one is lactobacillus. And I know you've probably heard lactobacillus before. I think there's 6 or so in the phytopower. Lactobacillus have been around for a long time. There was a wonderful scientist, Eli Menshnikov, early on that suggested bacteria present in fermented milk products would implant, and that these beneficial lactic acid producing bacteria in the gut would arrest intestinal putrefaction and must at the same time postpone the amelioration of old age. Right? This idea that these lactobacillus were really important for us. As we do in my lab and in other labs, we do these things called next generation sequencing, where I could tell you, I mean, I could basically sequence all your gut microbiomes in about 2 weeks. It's really easy to do. But one of the things is then disentangling that information that's associated with it. One of the things that we're understanding is lactobacillus, and the reason why it's so good that it's in your phytopower is it confers tons of benefits, right? Where Menshikov came from was, he said, I looked at these Bulgarian peasants and they drank tons of fermented milk products and they had a high level of longevity. They lived for a long period of time. They were happy. They were incredibly happy people because a lot of these fermented products enhance these neurotransmitters. They bring down this idea of stress and they enhance that feeling of well-being. One thing that we have learned more so is that lactobacillus are not always permanent members in your gut microbiome, right? They're not like bifidos are the ones that are attached to that slime in your river. But lactobacillus are ones that are passing through. And if you're not drinking kefir, or if you're not drinking some other fermented product, or kombucha, if you're taking phytopower, those bacteria are always being replaced in your system, right? Which is a beneficial thing because otherwise they're transitory, or thought of kind of transitory members in our gut microbiome. This is a picture of Menshikov right down here. So one of the things that we've looked at, this is an article, probiotic lactobacillus fermentum. It improves the cognitive behavior and modulates immune response with the gut microbiome. We assign this, I don't study mice because if you study mice, you have to write all of this extra stuff to get, there's like animal rights, things that you have to worry about. I much rather just work with bacteria. Nobody cares how many bacteria you kill. But this idea, they gave these mice lactobacillus, right? And they had old mice, young mice, and they ran them through cognitive tests. And the more lactobacillus that they fed them over time, the higher cognitive awareness they had. They were able to solve mazes better. They did a terrible thing called a swim test where they would throw the mice in and see how long they swam before they kind of gave up. I know it sounds terrible. But all of this was a more cognitive awareness associated with aging. And really, there's one thing that is becoming more clear is that your gut microbiome is your second brain. And there's tons of acetylcholine and gamma-aminobutyrate. These are being generated by lactobacillus, and they're things that keep kind of relax us and also stimulate our energy and cognitive awareness. The last one is to give you a general idea of gut microbiome science. People always try to figure out, how is your gut microbiome different from someone else's? Why is it different? How is it different? What different functions are you receiving from it one way or another? One science that has kind of taken hold, and there's controversy one way or another, people break down your gut microbiome by your diet. As you age as a youngster, your gut microbiome changes dramatically, right? As you get older, it's a little harder to nudge it one way or another, but one thing that does do it is diets. So one of the diets, we call them veggie munchers. These are Prevotella-dominated systems, Prevotella is a type of bacteria. It's mostly high in fiber, whole foods, grains, basically what you have in Phytopower, right? That color blend that's associated with it puts you into a veggie muncher. The next one is the Western gourmand, right? This idea that these are Bacteroidetes. Sometimes when you read in the literature and look at some of these, sometimes Bacteroidetes, they might not do as much beneficial things to you as other bacteria in your gut. This is high intake of animal protein, fats, as well as refined sugar. And then down here is a grain lover. This just is a higher Ruminococcus is your dominant bacteria. They're dietary rich in fiber and resistant starches, but it's not as diverse, right? This is not as diverse that you're getting as a dietary need. You're eating a lot of grains, which are still plants, which are power, but you're not having all that high level of variety. This is an article, microbiology enterotypes. So these are called enterotypes. In personalized nutrition and obesity management. One of the big findings of this paper was, if you are a veggie muncher and you are trying to effectively lose weight, which is something that people think about a fair amount, is that idea those gut microbiome are actually going to be beneficial and actually help you as far as in losing weight and managing weight, way more than the Western gourmand. And this is irrespective of calorie intake. The gut microbiome that you have is modulating how you are digesting the food, how you're utilizing that food. What's sad is that when we eat high proteins or fats, we get a lot of that energy. We harness that energy, but we're only harnessing that energy from those same products that we just see over and over and over and over. So our body does a great job at breaking those things down and utilizing them, but there's no diversity in what we eat. And so in that way, we might be able to absorb a lot of the nutrients from it, but while we're absorbing a lot of nutrients from it, we are also not as healthy as we could be. So this idea of diverse and a rich environment. And we can go back and forth a fair amount on what a balanced gut looks like. And I'm sure maybe we'll talk about that a little bit in the afternoon, Adam and I. But one thing I want to touch on, you are more than your gut, right? There are more microbiomes that are on you besides your gut microbiome. This is the one that's gotten the most attention because it is, again, it's that idea of a rainforest, right? You got a rainforest of bacteria that's, again, highest density on Earth in your own gut. In your large intestine. The skin compared to the gut, I don't know if Kelly would want me to say this, is kind of like a desert, right? You're out in the desert, it's an oxidizing environment. So when someone says an antioxidant, right, they're like, oh, this is a superfood, it's an antioxidant. When we live we are being exposed all the time to what's called free radicals. It's kind of a weird name, but free radicals are basically going out there and they're stripping electrons or stripping energy from your cells. They're bad. We don't really want these around. Your air, the air that you breathe, oxygen, unfortunately, we get a lot of energy from breathing oxygen, but oxygen is also what ultimately is going to kill you. Oxygen generates a lot of these free radicals. They're in the atmosphere. They're exposed to your skin. They cause aging. They cause cell death. And really, it is kind of a desert in some part. When we look at the skin, let's go back. When we look at the skin microbiome, there are different regions based on the characteristics. Like I told you, your gut is anaerobic. It stays in different parts longer or different times, just like in your body. You got your feet experience a little more moist, so it's not as a desert. It might be like a grassland. Let's say a grassland. It makes it a little better. And then we have drier parts, we have moist parts, we have oily parts. Right? This would be more like your scalp would more kind of be a little swampy, I guess would be the best way to say it. But in these areas, we're identifying certain microbiomes that exist and are unique to these. The diversity, the amount of different individuals that we see, is a lot less. But that doesn't mean that it's not doing or doesn't have beneficial activity for you. One of the big things is kind of like bacteria on you cause your skin to be a little more acidic. And they give you a protective coating on your skin that stops other pathogens when you're walking around to get a hold. Also, when you get cut or you get damaged, they're part of that immune response that is helping your body know, hey, there's something going on here and we need to be aware of it. So I want you to think of this propionova bacteria, right? These propionoics are the ones that we would associate with acne, but your skin microbiome is much more than just acne. And really, this is kind of the message I want to leave you with is you are your gut microbiome. You are your microbiome, not just your gut microbiome. You are your microbiome, and we are this what's called a supra-organism, right? You're multiple organisms that come together to make you. This is Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man. He was built off an architect. He said basically that there are two perfect modes or proportions to human man. He said this is the atomically proportionate best of our species, and there was this idea of the circle and the square. But one thing that was left off of this idea of the ideal individual is that we are more than just our human selves. Right? We have this microbiome that's in us and on us. Microbial cloud sometimes has like this sad connotation a little bit to it, but this idea, I think of it more as like a microbial sunshine. And when we're aware of our microbiome and we learn how to better take care of it, it will ultimately still become even more that center of health for all of us individuals. Thanks for the opportunity to come in.
All right, give it up one more time for Zach. Dr. Zach.